it's Casey, and today we're going to talk about the best books that I read in 2021. So 2021 was a pretty decent reading year for me. I read 75 books overall, and when I was trying to put together my list for this video, there were a couple of clear standouts, but I kind of struggled to figure out what I had read that I really loved last year. So I went back through and counted all of the books that I gave 5 stars to last year, and it came out to 14. So I wanted to make this a top 10 video, and we have exactly enough books to make it a top 10 video, because some of those 5 stars include rereads or multiple books from a series, and I try not to include multiple entries from the same series on my best books list. I pick my favorite of the series and let it kind of stand in for the series as a whole. So excluding rereads, because if I didn't read them for the first time this year, there was really no point in putting them on the best books of this year list. And taking out series, there is exactly 10 books to talk about. I thought about cutting this down to the ones I was just like really excited about, but the fact that there was exactly 10 makes me feel like I should just go through them. So these are going to be ranked in order as best as I can from my memory of how these went. So starting off with number 10, we have Rat Queens Volume 1. So it's kind of weird, I think, for me to put a short little fantasy graphic novel on this list. Usually that's not the kind of thing I would give 5 stars to, but I remember reading this and absolutely loving it. The energy in this was exactly what I was looking for. It's a very specific type of energy, but it's very fun. So this is a fantasy graphic novel series about this all-female like band of adventurers, and it follows them throughout different like quests and journeys and things that they're going on, and it's so much fun. These comics are very gory, very bloody, very graphic, but very fun. Like the sense of humor in this was exactly the kind of sense of humor that I get along with well in this kind of thing. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but that being said, there are still some very good character moments and some clear progression of character, and I don't think I was expecting to have as much fun with this as I did. On a critical level, this one has some flaws, and like later on in the series, I don't feel like it had the same charm as this first one did for me. But I remember just having so much fun with this when I read it, and there are a couple of quotes in here that are so good. I explicitly remember closing this one and being like, yeah, 5 stars. That was just a really fun romp, and I stand by that. So coming in at number 9, we have The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. So this is a nonfiction book by John Green. It's a series of essays where he kind of talks about different ideas or concepts and rates them on a 5-star scale, like a Yelp review kind of a thing. And this is a book that I have a hard time being objective about, to be honest with you, which is part of why it's lower on this list than some of the other ones. I've seen a lot of people be kind of underwhelmed with this book, and I get it. I completely do. But this series of essays, if you didn't know, was based on a podcast that John Green did for a couple years. I think he's starting to do it again, but where he did these kind of essays as podcast episodes, and I listened to that pretty consistently while it was coming out, and I really loved it, and it meant a lot to me, and some of those essays like made me cry. In particular, the Auld Lang Syne episode gets me very emotional every single time. So I already had a pretty strong connection with this and was seriously looking forward to this going into it. And this has some of the essays from the original podcast as well as new essays throughout it. And while I've heard a lot of people accuse this of being like kind of shallow, surface level, and not going as deep as they wanted it to, and I can see that, I really enjoyed this because I'm not used to reading those kinds of styles of essays. If you are, maybe this isn't going to do it for you, but for me, this was something I wasn't typically used to reading. I already had an attachment going into it, and I just really enjoyed it. It was very nice to, throughout the month that I read this, kind of just pick it up and read 1 or 2 here and there. So this book for me had a lot of the same charm that he does throughout all of his other works, but it was in a very different format, and it was something I was very happy to see. I think if you can get a hold of this through the audiobook, that might be a better experience because it's way more similar to that podcast that I loved. And I will admit, I do think I like the podcast more than this book, but still really love this series of essays. I was looking forward to it so much. And overall, I really enjoyed kind of the arc that you can see throughout the essays, because while they're not like really connected, I felt like thematically there is definitely an arc that it goes through, and I just felt like it was very well done. And so it makes it onto this list. So for number 8, we have The Lies of Lamora by Scott Lynch. So this is an adult fantasy book that I have been meaning to read for so long, and I finally got to it this year. So this is the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series, and still the only one of them that I've actually read. So this follows our main character, Lamora, who is the leader of this group of thieves known as the Gentleman Bastards. And this book follows this thieving crew as they're attempting to pull off a heist and get wrapped up into kind of a war going on in the underbelly of this city. And I really really enjoyed this book. I know this one has a ton of hype around it and it is earned. It really delivers on what it's trying to do. That being said, this was way darker and way grittier than I expected it to be. I remember one particular scene in this that actually like made my stomach kind of churn, but I was so invested in this. I really love all of the characters. The dynamic between Locke and John was so good. And just the entire group, I absolutely love. I am just a sucker for heist stories in general. I know this about myself for some reason. If you take fantasy and start putting crime into it, I am like so all in on that every single time. And this definitely had that element to it, obviously. And this did it so well. Something else I really like about this is the existence of magic in this world, even though our main characters really don't use it. I think that adds some interesting world building elements. I really felt connected to this world. It felt very real and fleshed out, and I really loved the characters in this. While some of the more specific details of the plots have started to fade away, because I read this kind of early in the year, I remember how I felt reading this book. And I just remember being so invested in it and caring so much about these characters and what happened, and being so curious to see how everything was gonna wrap up. I think the hype almost got to me on this one because I expected this to be like a new favorite book of all time, and I don't think it is that, as you'll notice by the fact that it's kind of on the lower half of my favorites list, but it is still absolutely a 5-star book, no questions asked. The next book on this list is Skin Game by Jim Butcher, and this is the, what, 14th? Maybe? I should look that up. 15th. So Skin Game is the 15th book in the Dresden Files series, and if you're not familiar, because I haven't read them since I caught up early last year, broadly speaking, the Dresden Files are about Wizard for Hire Harry Dresden, who works as a consultant and a private investigator for the Chicago Police Department, and he kind of works with them to solve crimes that look like they have some kind of unexplained, possibly supernatural element to them. And this series expands very quickly beyond that, but it does start off as a very mystery of the week kind of a series. And this one, being the 15th book in the series, is so informed by everything that has already happened throughout the rest of this series. And this was one of my favorite ones since Changes, which was book 12, and I think on my favorite books of the year before. I had so much fun with this, and maybe that is because it is a heist novel. Being very vague and giving you just the basic premise of this one, Harry ends up going on a heist to steal something from the vault of Hades. That is as specific as I can get, but it had all of the elements of the heist novel that I love. All of the things I really love about the story beats of a heist novel, it had. And it had it with characters that I had grown to become so invested in over the course of 15 books. So I really loved this. I also remember feeling like there was some really good development in some of the characters and some of the relationships that we had seen up until this point. And I just remember being really excited about this one. While I love the Dresden Files, I remember feeling like it could get a little bit samey, which is why I like spaced them out a little bit. But this one for me, I was just like, hell yeah, heist novel, let's go. And like, that was enough to push it over the edge for me. I remember just being so excited about this one and having so much fun with the setup. And then the implications that this had were also very important. It's not like this one wasn't connected to the broader overarching plots that we'd been seeing, but it was a bit more unique than some of the other ones we had seen up until this point, and I really liked that. It was very refreshing. And I think I said it was my favorite Dresden book since Changes, which is true, but I also don't think anything else reached 5 stars after that either, so this was kind of like the peak in the last chunk of Dresden for me. Coming in at number 6, we have The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. So this is incredibly shiny. So this is the 3rd and final book to the Daevabad trilogy. So this is a series about a girl named Nari who lives in 14th century Cairo, and she works as an assistant to an apothecary and a healer, and she kind of scams people for a living. But one day she's performing a ritual, but she accidentally summons a Jinn warrior, and in doing so gets whisked off to the mysterious magical city of Daevabad, where she finds out that she is much more tied into Jinn and Deva politics than she ever thought she would be. And I really liked this series. I remember this series was kind of a slow burn for me. I remember the first book I gave 4 stars, second book it was 4.5, and then this one was 5. I know I saw so many people loving this series, and I liked it a lot, but I didn't get the love for it for the first couple of books. This one really sold me on it. I remember originally I was struggling to connect to the characters, and at this point I was so all in on the characters, but I remember feeling so strongly for some of these characters that at a certain moment in this book, I literally cried. Like, I remember really loving this book. That being said, the details of this one have also faded a little bit from my mind, but I remember being so blown away and thinking about this one for days after, could not stop thinking about it. And I went back and watched my original like wrap-up review of this book, and watching it made me want to reread this series because I felt so much when I read this the first time. So it definitely deserves a place on here, even if my love for it has kind of faded out a little bit more in recent months, because I read this pretty early on last year. And there's something about a series that sticks the landing so hard that always like elevates the book and the series for me. So this happened with the Mistborn trilogy too. My favorite was the third book, and when my favorite is the third book for me, it just makes everything better because I feel like finales are so hard to land right. There's always going to be some things that are still kind of loose ends. There's always going to be things that you wish resolved differently than they did. But when they nail it, it feels so right. And this was one that like absolutely nailed it. Questions were answered. Everything was tied back together. People ended up in places that made sense. I really loved this. The development of these characters across the series was just top tier. So now we're in the top half of my books this year with number 5, and that is going to be A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. So this is the second book in the Wayfarers series, which is a series of basically companion novels, but this one does follow the events of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and all of Becky Chambers' books are very like small sci-fi, like very, very character driven, character focused, and focus on a lot of like very personal themes and themes about like found family and things like that. And this book was no exception. I put off reading this for so long because I was afraid of it not living up to the hype of the first book, which is my favorite book of all time. And I guess to be fair, since it's not number 1 on the list, it technically didn't live up to that hype, but it's still a 5-star book. It's still so good. I cried so much. I have like a couple of scenes in here tabbed out that like, I just felt so many things when reading this. I can't give you a huge amount of specifics on the plot of this one because the characters that are involved, I think knowing that they're involved is a bit of a spoiler for the first book. This follows the relationship between 2 people primarily. And this one, by nature of both of the people that it's about, is very much about figuring out what it means to be human, or not even human, but what it means to be yourself and figuring out who you are and who you want to be and what's important to you. And so it absolutely has that same found family element, but this one also talks a lot about trauma and the way that people heal from that and grow together. And this book made me so emotional throughout different parts of it. I love this series. I need to read everything that Becky Chambers has ever written because every single one of them just like speaks to me on a level that I adore. This one was also very interesting because it was kind of told in 2 timelines. So we had our 2 main characters, one of which was helping the second character. But it basically followed her helping the second character in present day, as well as going back to the first character's kind of childhood and looking at the events that she went through and how she learned to overcome some of the same challenges that she's now helping this other person through. And it was just so well done, and the way everything was woven together I thought was so good. It is pretty different, in my opinion, to the first book. The themes are the same, the writing is the same, the charm of it is the same, but like in structure and to some extent in tone, I felt like it was very different. But I really love this. I know there are some people who actually like this one more, and I think it's going to have to do with which themes that you're going to resonate the most with. And to me, I think that first one was just so much exactly up my alley that it's going to be hard to top it because it now holds like a mythical place as my favorite book ever. So this one is amazing and I absolutely loved it. And I regret putting off reading it for so long. She says putting off reading the third one. Coming in at number 4, we have The Golden Fool by Robin Hobb. Wow, this matches my outfit. This book, we're getting into the section of the favorites video where I have so many opinions that I can't actually articulate any of them, and I just kind of start mumbling and screaming. Here we are. So this is the second book in the Tawny Man trilogy, which is the third book in Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderling universe. And this is the one I'm using to kind of stand in for the entirety of the Tawny Man trilogy, but I think this was my favorite of the 3. It's very close between this one and the first one, Fool's Errand. Fool's Errand definitely had one really gut-punchy emotional moment. This one I just felt so invested in the entire time. And I know when I initially read it, because I read them very close together, this one I felt stronger about in the moment. So I'm going to trust past Casey's judgment on that. So I'm going to give you just like the brief synopsis of the Farseer trilogy, which is the first series in this universe. It follows a boy named Fitz, who is the bastard son of the prince-in-waiting Prince Chivalry. And one day he's basically dropped on the palace doorstep and told, "This is your problem now." And Chivalry ends up abdicating the throne in shame. So Fitz is raised by the stable master Burrick. And while he's there, the king decides that he would be most helpful as the royal assassin. So then he's raised to be trained to be this royal assassin. And the first series follows Fitz from like ages basically 6 to like 16, something like that. And then this series happens 15 years later. So Fitz is fully like a 30-year-old man in this series. And so this book follows Fitz as he gets roped back into a lot of the politics at Buckkeep that he had been trying to avoid for the last 15 years. And I loved this series. This series focuses a lot on the relationship between Fitz and the Fool, which I think I can say based on the titles of all of these, it's pretty obvious. And I absolutely love the dynamic between Fitz and the Fool, which is why I think this book was my favorite. This book focused the most heavily on that to me, and I remember that not much happened in this book. Like, this book was very much wrapping up some of the, let's call it, emotions from the first book, and then setting up for where we were going in the third book. This book itself didn't have that much in it, but it blew me away for what it was. I was so emotionally invested in this the entire time. This whole book was basically just like, finishing up, setting it off, and just character development in the middle. And I ate all of it up. I cared so much about everything Fitz was going through. I cared so much about what the Fool was going through, what they were going through. Together is what killed me. As well as all of the new characters that we've been introduced and the way we've roped in characters from that first series and the Live Ship Trader series. The way everything is tying together is so interesting and so beautiful. And to me, Robin Hobb's series continue to get better. I feel like each series in some way kind of tops the one before it. And this book has a ton of like political maneuverings in it that are very interesting and very entertaining. But the thing to me is, for a book that not much happened in, for me to cry and feel this sense of like amazement and wonderment at some lines, like there's one line I tabbed out in here because it made me feel like a kid discovering fantasy again for the first time, like just that magical feeling, while also making me cry my eyes out. This book is so good. Robin Hobb has a chokehold on my emotions and I don't know what to do about it. She writes characters better than anyone else I've ever read. She can make me care so deeply or hate so deeply, or sometimes both. Sometimes I hate a character with every fiber of my being, and then she finds a way to make me care about them by the end, and I don't understand how she does it. But this book was my favorite of the Tawny Man trilogy, and I am still not over some of what happened in Tawny Man. And I don't know if I will ever be. In third place, we have Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames. So I read this, I think, in January of last year. And to me, it sticks out as one of the best books that I read. Like, before I went through my spreadsheet and looked at what all of the 5 stars actually were, I knew for a fact this was gonna be in the top half of them. It just immediately sticks out as one that I adored. This is an adult fantasy book that basically follows this retired band of adventurers as one member kind of comes up to the doorsteps of all of the other ones and says, "Hi, my daughter's missing. We need to go find her. We need to get the band back together." And it's just this group of like old man adventurers going through, rounding each other back up and trying to rescue this daughter. And it's so good. The tone of this book was amazing. It absolutely nails what it wants to be. This book does not take itself too seriously in a way that was so enjoyable. The other interesting thing about this book is that all of the different bands of adventurers are literally set up to be like rock bands and mimic rock bands. So each person kind of fulfills a different niche of like a classic rock band. And the way that the different adventuring parties are viewed by the towns that they go through and things like that are really meant to mimic like touring bands. And it has a very specific, very fun vibe to it. This is another book that I like started putting tabs in moments that just like made me laugh out loud or made me very emotional, because this book made me care a lot about the different characters in it. This book was not just funny, like this book was not just entertaining, but this was the most fun I had reading a book possibly for the entirety of last year. I got so invested in these characters. The world was so much fun. This really read like a D&D campaign with the same amount of like heart-wrenching moments that can have, as well as those moments where you're sitting around the table just literally crying, you're laughing so hard. That is what this felt like to me. I loved this book. And this is one that I started recommending to my real life friends like immediately after reading this, because I really feel like this book deserves more attention than it gets. Not to say this is an underhyped book, but it's just so good. Number 2 on this list is going to be Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the second book in the Stormlight archive. I read Words of Radiance this year, as well as Oathbringer. Way of Kings I read the year before. And I think this is my favorite over Oathbringer. But I have given every single book in this series 5 stars, no questions, like didn't have to deliberate. It was just like, yes, obviously this is a 5-star book, it's amazing. I struggle so hard to explain the plot of the Stormlight Archive, so like just bear with me for a second. Generally speaking, this series takes place in Roshar, and on Roshar there used to be this like fabled and legendary group known as the Knights Radiance that would fight off this enemy called the Voidbringers to prevent desolations from occurring, which was basically like cataclysmic apocalyptic type events. So the Knights Radiance actually disband in disgrace and just kind of abandon the world like 1,000 years ago. And so this book picks up when it looks like there are some hints that maybe another desolation is coming back, or that maybe the Knights Radiant are coming back, the Voidbringers are coming back. These events from history are starting to creep into the present. And this is a multi-POV story that follows a lot of different characters, and I adore all of the characters in this. The world building in this series is actually incredible. I have so many thoughts and opinions about this series, so many like theories and things like that obviously I can't get into because they're spoilers, but the way everything is getting tied together is so fascinating to me, and it's very clear when you read Brandon Sanderson to me that he knows exactly where he's going the entire time he does it, because he gives you enough information to figure it out, but doesn't make it obvious, right? Like you never kind of guess where you're going, but it's not because it comes out of nowhere. Upon reread or reflection on it, you can clearly see how the groundwork was laid out for all of these plot twists. This series in particular also has a pretty heavy emphasis on mental health in a way that I find fascinating to do in a fantasy setting. And I think ultimately that this book is my favorite because of some of the development of specific characters, namely Kaladin. I have so many opinions about everyone in this series, and these books are always so long, and I manage to fly through them. This is the kind of series that when I'm not reading it, I am thinking about it all day long and constantly wishing I could go back to reading it. I typically get these books in audiobook as well as the physical book so that I can listen to it while I'm cooking or taking a shower or driving, and then when I'm not doing any of those things I can sit down with the physical book and blaze through it. I love these so much. The way I get so completely sucked into these books is just amazing. I have no words. This series is incredible. If you haven't read it before, what are you doing? I can't be the first person to recommend this to you. Go do it. Okay, and here we are at my favorite book of 2021, and I think that's going to be The Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. I'm counting this as a different series than The Golden Fool, because while it's still part of the realm of the Elderlings, it's a completely different story. It's not first person in Fitz's perspective. This is a multi-POV fantasy book that takes place in a totally different place. And if I didn't count it, we'd only have 9 to talk about. So like, it's fine. I am somewhat surprised that this is my favorite book of the year, but it's the book I can't stop thinking about. I read this in January of last year. Like, this was like the 3rd book I read in the entirety of 2021. It was my first 5-star read, and I have not stopped thinking about it since I read it. Is part of that due to the fact that I have friends who have started reading it? Yeah, probably. But even before they were doing that, I spent so much time thinking about this book, thinking about how good it was, thinking about what it did. This book blew my mind in a way that I can't completely describe to you. So this is the 2nd book of The Live Ship Traders, which is the 2nd series in Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings. The Live Ship Traders primarily follows the Vestrit family, who owns a live ship. And a live ship is a ship that when 3 generations of a family die on its decks, it literally becomes alive. The figurehead becomes a living being with a personality and a name and its own ideas and actions. But they're incredibly valuable because they are the only ships that are able to navigate up the Rainwild River to trade with the incredible, fascinating, magical goods that the Rainwilders have. And this series, to me, had some of the most fascinating and incredible plot twists. This book, as opposed to both Farseer and Tawny Man, is multi-POV. So there were lots of different characters in here that I cared about so much. I was a little worried when we left the Six Duchies that getting a new cast of characters to care about wasn't going to get me as invested. And I should have just trusted Robin Hobb because I was so invested immediately. I also wasn't super confident how I was gonna feel with like the boats, the ships, the pirate type setting. I loved that as well. It was so good. I should just trust Robin Hobb more because it's always so good. I think this book is my favorite of the three, because there is some very fascinating character development in here. Again, Robin Hobb has the ability, this is the series in which she has me hate a character and then suddenly I love that character by the end and I'm just like, how did you trick me like this? But the thing about this series that makes it stand out so much further than the rest to me, despite the fact that I am a character-driven reader, it's the plot of this and what we do. I described Robin Hobb to a couple of my friends as like being very zoomed in on a huge tapestry. Like when you read the Farseer trilogy, it feels like you can recognize that it's very well done, it's well crafted, but you're only looking at like a 2x2 inch section of the tapestry. In every book, every series, it kind of zooms out more and more and you can see how it's all intricately woven together. And to me, Mad Ship has been, out of all of the books, the moment that we zoomed out the furthest, that I felt like I started to understand the scope of what we were doing here and how everything was going to be linked together in a way that I feel like I haven't gotten in any of the other books. That being said, I'm not going to say I understand the entire plot of the Realm of the Elderlings and where we're going to end up, but this was like the first real connections to me of how it was all going to work. Some of the plot twists in this were amazing. Some of the way characters were woven back into the series blew my mind. Just some of what we did in here was so fascinating. And also, my favorite character in here is probably an extremely depressed boat. I don't know what to tell you. There are people who, when they read Realm of the Elderlings, skip live ship traders because they just want to focus on Fizz's story. And I think that is a huge mistake. I think this book, this series, has kind of the keys to the kingdom when it comes to understanding what the Realm of the Elderlings is doing and what Robin Hobb is capable of crafting. Because to me, this book just, I just can't stop thinking about some of the plot twists and some of what we learned in this book and how fundamentally it changes everything going forward, but also what we've already done. It puts it in an entirely new light and just like completely. So because of the fact that I just can't stop thinking about the implications of this book has to be #1 for me. And here they are, stacked very much like they're going to fall over. These are my top 10 books of 2021. I'm putting those down because that was a health hazard. I feel like I didn't have quite as many that I wanted to like scream from the rooftops about as I did the year before, but there were still definitely a few in there that I feel so strongly about. If you've read any of these, please talk to me about them because I absolutely adore them. Also, tell me what your favorite books of this year was. I'm really hoping that this coming year I get as many, if not more, 5-star reads and books that I want to shout from the rooftops, but we'll see how it goes. So I think that's all I've got for you guys today. If you want to keep up with what I'm reading, I have a link to my Goodreads down in the description below, but other than that, I will see you guys next time.